Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to Ukrainians around the world. Today is Friday, May 23rd, 2025. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Our guest today is Orest Deychakiwsky, who worked for the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, also known as the Helsinki Commission, which is a U.S. government agency, and is an analyst on U.S. Ukraine relations. Welcome, Orest. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Thanks for the invitation, Mike. Glad to join you.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us today. To start off with, can you tell our audience a little bit about your educational and professional background?
Sure. I grew up in the Cleveland area in a very activist Ukrainian family and community at large. Both my parents were active in the day, and my two brothers were and continue to be. I went to Jesuit high school in Cleveland, St. Ignatius, then the University of Notre Dame. And afterwards, in 1979, I came to Washington for grad school to Georgetown. And while at grad school, I worked for a couple of years too at the Republican National Committee. And then in November 1981, I began working at the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is more commonly known as the Helsinki Commission. And, throughout my more than 35 years there, I retired in 2017. I had a whole slew of country and issue responsibilities in my portfolio. But while I covered, various countries at various times, Ukraine, and then I guess followed by Belarus were the major parts of my country portfolio. And, in retirement, I'm still involved with various organizations, including Ukrainian American organizations. And I do some writing, including for the Ukrainian Weekly and Vilni Media.
Orest, let's discuss your experience with the OSCE. What does it do? How long have you been involved with the organization? And what is the connection with the U.S. Helsinki Commission?
The Helsinki Commission is an independent U.S. government agency. It's located on Capitol Hill. It's mostly congressional. It's bicameral and bipartisan, which I must say I really appreciated and liked. But also it has an executive branch component. And it's charged with monitoring and encouraging compliance by all signatory states with the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, whose 50th anniversary is coming up this year on August 1st, so in a few months. Now, during the Cold War, we focused on human rights, human contacts, democracy in the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact countries, which, of course, were extremely repressive. And we did this, meaning Helsinki Commission, we did this on the Hill, various ways on the Hill, with hearings and statements and resolutions and bills. And we worked with the State Department, often trying to encourage them to be more proactive on these issues. And also as members of U.S. delegations to various meetings of, well, then it was the OSCE's predecessors. It was called CSCE. I know it gets kind of confusing, but that's what it was called during the Cold War. And we would push the Soviets at these meetings, most of which were held in Europe. And just to cite two Ukraine-related examples, so, the audience has a sense of the kinds of issues we raised. One was to defend Soviet Helsinki monitoring groups, the largest and the most severely repressed of which was the Ukrainian Helsinki group. And some of these Ukrainian Helsinki monitors, well, some of them unfortunately died in the gulags as late as 1985, but others, a few years after being released, became the founding fathers or I consider them to be anyhow, of independent Ukraine. They were leaders of the independence movement, Ruch, people like Vyacheslav Chornovil and Mikhailo Horin and Levko Lukyanenko, all of whom, I had the privilege of getting to know. And the other Ukraine related example was that the Helsinki Commission, Congress in general, we pushed very hard on the Soviet government to legalize the Ukrainian Catholic Church, which at that time, in the late 80s, was the largest banned religious organization in the world. And then with the fall of the evil empire, this OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, eventually grew from 35 countries to 57 countries. And we'd call out those who, violated their freely undertaken Helsinki commitments, especially on human rights, countries like Belarus and Central Asian countries. And of course, Russia was the major violator, and with its invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and then full-fledged invasion in 2024, being the starkest illustration of its violations of its international commitments. In fact, I remember, for instance, after the annexation of Crimea and intrusion in Donbass in 2014, I'd often make the point in, resolutions, congressional resolutions and statements and talking points from my senators and congressmen that Russia's violated not just one, but each and every one of the 10 founding principles of the OSCE that are enshrined in this Helsinki Final Act, including territorial integrity, sovereignty, inviolability of borders, and not to mention human rights and others. And of course, the Helsinki Commission throughout the years and now continues to support all sorts of measures designed to punish Russia for their violations and to support Ukraine. Suffice it to say, Moscow's never been a fan of the Helsinki Commission, simply because we always try to hold them accountable for their, violations and abuses.
Orest, have there been any major changes in American public perception of Ukraine since the Russian invasion began in February 2022?
Yeah, well, first of all, Americans obviously know a heck of a lot more about Ukraine than they did in the past, and especially, during the Cold War when Ukraine was basically a terra incognita. And I think the American public initially was extremely supportive, and both in terms of moral support and backing and admiration for Ukrainians' bravery and resilience, and it was manifested in many ways, including huge war-related charitable giving for humanitarian causes. Americans were extremely generous in that respect. And also, I kind of saw this support. It wasn't only limited to places where there's a lot of Ukrainian Americans, but I now live in retirement about 70 miles away from DC. And believe me, there are very few Ukrainian Americans, but you used to see and still see some Ukrainian flags, and religious services were held, and film screenings, et cetera, et cetera. Granted, things have slowed down a little in the last couple of years as people have become a little more complacent, and I think to some extent this is natural. But I think overall, public support is still quite high. Most Americans sympathize with Ukraine far, far more than with Russia. And, even in recent polling, 61% support military aid to Ukraine. 80% of Americans do not like Vladimir Putin, and 86% blame him for the war. And also, something I saw just within the last few days, 60% of Americans are unhappy with Trump's stance towards Russia.
That's a good segue into the next question. Do you think the Trump administration has a genuine interest in helping to end the war in Ukraine?
I don't think the Trump administration has a genuine interest in bringing the war to an end and this whole peace process. I mean, I think Donald Trump claims he wants to end the bloodshed and I think that may be sincere, but he isn't really acting like it, and what you've seen in this peace process so far aren't real negotiations, and I read this, so this isn't original, but not real negotiations, but the imitation of negotiations. The reality is Putin does not want peace. He's been stonewalling and stalling and slow rolling and, call it what you will. Just a day or two ago, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov came right out and admitted that they don't even want a ceasefire, But Trump isn't putting any real pressure on Putin. He's so far wanted concessions only from the Ukrainian side and nothing. It's sort of like carrots for the Russian side, sticks for the Ukrainian side. Although I think both he and Vance are slowly realizing that it is Putin who's the problem. With that ceasefire proposal, don't forget it was in March, 2 months ago, that the U.S. and Ukraine proposed a 30-day ceasefire. And, we basically got nowhere since then. And Putin hasn't been budging 1 inch on his demands, which, I think people realize are non-starters for ceasefire, addressing what he calls the root causes of the war. But what he wants is demilitarization of Ukraine. He wants Ukraine's capitulation in the long run. That's pretty obvious. But for example, he doesn't even want to allow Ukraine. Well, he wants not only to keep the Ukrainian territory that the Russians already control, but even that territory in Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson Oblast that the Russians don't even control. So it's truly beyond the bounds. He kind of wants to have his cake and eat it. And I don't want to reiterate the point, but so far he's been playing Trump. Hopefully Trump truly will realize this and do something about it. And we'll see if things change too, with Republican lawmakers are urging Trump to take a tougher line against Putin on ending the war. It seems that their confidence in Trump's approach to peace talks has fallen. But now comes the hard question, and that is, are they ready to act?
Well, that's my next question. Just this morning, I read about this piece of legislation that is co-sponsored in the Senate by Senator Richard Blumenthal, who's a Democrat, and Senator Lindsey Graham, who's a Republican. And it's basically a piece of legislation that would impose 500% tariffs on any goods that come from countries imported into the U.S., those countries that are trading with Russia, if they buy oil, gas, and so forth. And one Ukrainian advisor to the president in Ukraine has suggested that if that happens, that could take away about 40% of the military budget of Russia, or about 150 billion. So I guess my question, and I think you just touched on it, is while this legislation is sitting there in the Senate and apparently 81 senators support it, and therefore it has enough support to be able to override any veto by President Trump. When do you think the Senate might act on this? There's been some reference to them waiting for this so-called memorandum that has been referenced, a memorandum between Russia and Ukraine about how to bring about peace. So what are your thoughts on that? And this will be our final question, by the way.
Well, you're asking the $64,000 question, but let me just, before talking specifically about the legislation, I just want to mention, because I think it's important to stress that Congress, there's been historically very strong bipartisan support for Ukraine, including even before independence, that I think I suggested earlier, and as well as after independence. And you really saw this, for instance, in 3 of the appropriations deals, okay, that happened following February 2022, which dispersed, or rather appropriated, huge sums of money Okay, it was truly historic. But so you had that as a backdrop. Unfortunately, what happened is kind of hit a road bump in last year when the MAGA force, isolationist forces, thwarted the 61 billion Ukraine aid package. And it took a while to overcome it and to get Speaker Johnson to finally allow that for a vote. And when it did come up to a vote, you had a substantial majority of the House pass it. And of course, it had passed the Senate too by a Senate majority. So that's sort of the backdrop of kind of where things stand. Basically, you have support except for the sort of MAGA isolationists. So in terms of are Republicans ready to act, it's really inconclusive now. First of all, 80 co-sponsors is an astounding number of co-sponsors. I can tell you from my own experience, not only me, but other staffers would be excited if on a bill or resolution we were involved with, you even had 1/4 that amount. So, and it's a very hard-hitting bill, but we're just not sure. First of all, hopefully it'll pass the Senate. It should, by all accounts, but some of that may be determined by what Trump wants to do, because while Republicans understand what's what, and they are urging Trump to take the tougher line against Putin, they're still kind of sensitive in terms of what Trump might want. So you could see all sorts of variations, either passage of bill, or you may see it amended or some other form of sanctions that may not be quite as tough. Some people have said that, 500% tariffs is ridiculous. So, we'll see. All this, that's a long way of saying all this is playing itself out. But then even if it passes the Senate, you got to still get it through the House, which again, I don't think will be a problem unless Speaker Johnson, in cahoots with Trump, blocks it. And then, of course, even if the House and Senate should pass something, there's no guarantee that Trump would not veto it. Although my suspicion is, and there's some precedent for that he wouldn't veto it if it does pass the Senate and the House. But another important thing, other than this legislation, because it's sanctions oriented and tariff oriented, but Congress really needs to continue some sort of military assistance, especially long range defense and rocket artillery and intelligence. I mean, we are providing some of that, but we need to step it up. There's still some left in the pipeline, but we're going to have to renew our military aid, even if it probably won't be the sums we've given in the past. Thankfully, Europe is stepping up in many respects, but there's still a gap, and the U.S. leadership role, I think, is still essential. But here, kind of to conclude, I'll leave with a thought. All of us, the administration, Congress, the public, here's what everyone must never, ever forget. And that's that, war criminal Putin only understands the language of strength and pressure, and he'll take every advantage of weakness, period, full stop. And we always have to be cognizant of that.
Orest, thank you so much for joining us today on Krynytsia.
You're very welcome.
I have been speaking with Orest Deychakiwsky, who worked for the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, also known as the Helsinki Commission, which is a U.S. government agency, and is an analyst on U.S. Ukraine relations. This episode of Krynytsia has been produced for the Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. I'm Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia. Until next time, that's all for now.